the idea and practice of radical inclusivity, which we've been kind of preoccupied with since 3:30 today, is liberal or even Jewish. I wanted to say something a bit kind of like, to start with, a sort of something ironic about how could I possibly be speaking about inclusivity when I live on the northwest coast of Scotland in one of the remotest areas of the country. There just seems, but I couldn't finish the sentence, so I'm hoping at the end of the session I'll have thought of something suitable to say, but maybe somebody else will be able to finish that sentence for me. But there you go. So anyway, look, just before I start, I mean, I kind of started, but just before I really start, I just want to say that this session is going to be about 30 to 35 minutes long. I mean, that's me speaking for about 30, 35 minutes. And if you miss any of the references that I make during this talk, then you could go to my website, which is blackshedshool.wordpress.com. And there you'll find a tab for courses, and you can click on that and you'll find Liberal Judaism Biennial 2021. And it just might be quite kind of like helpful for people if I kind of like skate over things too quickly. Right, this is the third chance to get started. I'm really starting now. I think it's without question probably that radical inclusivity is a good thing. Well, it probably is a good thing. But what seems like a kind of rather straightforward solution to long-standing histories of exclusion may in fact turn out to be, I think, rather more complicated than we had initially thought. And I certainly can't do justice to that complexity tonight. So I'm kind of reluctantly restricting myself to looking at, well, one, possibly two, and if I push it, you know, maybe three political, philosophical, and occasionally theological strands of thinking, and how they impact on the idea and practice of radical inclusivity. For those who embrace this concept of radical inclusivity, especially I think within progressive Judaism, is a concept and policy that points towards generous community, open and welcoming to all. And any denial of this seems to undermine the fundamental Jewish value of hospitality, which I'm somewhat equating tonight with inclusivity. For others, however, this concept of radical inclusivity is ideological, and it's been brought into Judaism and will ultimately undermine Judaism across the denominations, because by accommodating different people with different lifestyles and different thinking, you ultimately undermine a set of specific values that have been considered fixed up until now. So in the time that we've got, I'd like to think about some of the issues that come up when we look a little bit more closely at radical inclusivity in the Jewish community. I want to ask specifically, and not to beat around the bush, whether there are aspects of radical inclusivity that clash with or actually counter elements of progressive Jewish thinking. So in a nutshell, what I'm actually trying to kind of propose here is, are there elements within radical inclusivity that are antithetical to long-standing Jewish values and teaching? So, for example, does radical inclusivity encourage an impossible ethics? Does it encourage homogeneity, sameness? Or does it perhaps encourage unhelpful utopic thinking? And crucially, does radical inclusivity stumble when it comes to addressing the systemic social and economic inequality of the excluded by focusing on recognition of diverse identities as its primary concern. Now, of course, I've set up the questions, but having said that, I'll also be looking at how radical inclusivity is an extension of some of the most inspiring teaching, as we've heard already tonight, that comes from within Judaism and, of course, from its textual traditions. So it's reasonably, but not entirely uncontentious to say that a model of hospitality or inclusivity has been made in numerous Torah texts and in the Talmudic interpretations of such teachings as love thy neighbor, care for the stranger. In Judaism, as we know, showing hospitality, hachnasat orkim, the bringing in of strangers or making people feel welcome, is a mitzvah. Although, of course, there have been many challenges to this generosity being extended to specific groups, women, LGBTQI, those who identify as secular or of mixed faith, patrilineal, Black, etc. The list just goes on. But having said that, we're all very familiar with the stories in Torah that teach that hospitality offered to the other, to the stranger, is a positive thing. So we have the celebrated narratives of Abraham offering hospitality to strangers and Rebecca helping the stranger at the well, although I've never really liked that story, but you know, it's there. And of course, in the Talmud, we find the very familiar instruction to let all who are in need, come and eat, which is a very kind of generous welcome. And one of my favorites in Talmud, a story that tells how Rabbi Yochanan, I don't know, he's saying something about hospitality. And Rabbi Yehuda says that actually welcoming wayfarers is greater than welcoming the Shekhinah. I'm not sure I like that, but I think it's got something to do with, I like the idea that somehow welcoming the stranger, the person who's journeying or traveling or whatever, should be more welcome than the indwelling presence of God. But I've always been a bit, I don't know, I feel a bit kind of odd about the Shekhinah, but we won't go into that now. But I think that's why I quite like this. So anyway, it's not much of a stretch to say that hospitality and including people is a long-standing tradition within Judaism, and one that continues today with heaps of amazing projects focused on doing exactly that. And liberal Judaism, particularly, has often led the way with its own record of active welcome and inclusion. And perhaps one of the least known, but well known to those who knew her, rabbis who struggled to articulate and put into practice new forms of inclusivity within progressive Judaism and within the community, was, of course, Rabbi Sheila Schulman, radical lesbian feminist and founder of the synagogue Bet Klal Israel in Notting Hill Gate. Well, it was then, it's moved, it's in central London now. There's such a lot to be said about Sheila and her theological, intellectual and political pursuit of inclusivity. But if you read her book, Watching for the Morning, Selected Sermons, you'll get a better idea of some of the struggles that come with creating an inclusive community. And crucially, this isn't the creation of an inclusive community. Yay, there we go, Charlie's got Sheila's book. This isn't a passive including of people. This was a community set up by people who had or who were feeling excluded. So there was quite a lot of agency in the setting up of Bet Klal Israel. So BKY, Bet Klal Israel, the shul that Sheila set up, the house of all Israel. this should have been a kind of straightforward, I think, community insofar as inclusivity was concerned, but it wasn't. It struggled with questions of who to include as well as who to exclude, and also whether liberal inclusivity was the same as radical inclusivity. So BKY, in some respects, because of Sheila's political and her kind of quite radical theology, was always, whatever happened in the community was always going to be a site of transgressive resistance to hegemonic conformity. So whatever, the authorities were saying, BKY was always going to be a synagogue that kind of tested the limits of authority. But by being part of a progressive Jewish movement, which is what BKY was, initially it was part of the Reform movement, and then it became part of the liberal Jewish community, it kind of unwittingly offered itself over to subtle and often not so subtle forms of control around such things as Jewish status issues and all the rights and practices that were connected with that, and the role of men in a community founded by radical feminists wasn't always clear. And of course, how are straight Jews going to kind of be welcomed or fit into a community that was founded by radical lesbian feminists? All these issues are interesting and challenging. But as a community, BKY, we worked with a model of what might be called, I think, liberal inclusivity. So it's not hugely ideological, but it enabled us at BKY to modify membership in ways that expanded possibilities of welcome to those who didn't strictly fit in with normative definitions of who was Jewish and who wasn't, which was, of course, a really positive place to be. But it was reformist. Its agenda was reformist. Its agenda was not radical. So what we probably should have done was to add the modifier radical to BKY's inclusivity policies and practices, so that rather than just adjusting the walls erected around the community and within the community, we could do something closer to the motto of the Biennial and break some walls down. Now, what's really interesting is that although BKY, 10, 20 years ago was fretting over whether it was liberally inclusive or whether it was radically inclusive, today, if you look around most liberal organizations, most liberal progressive faith organizations, you don't see struggle. You don't see the struggle to try and work out whether they're being liberal or whether they're being radical. And I think that this is because, well, I don't know why it is, but basically most liberal faith organizations now describe themselves as radically inclusive. And you don't have to look very far to see an abundance of rather generic statements about what that involves. So for example, and it's actually one that I really like, a description that's been handed out or given out by the new project, new synagogue project for Washington, states that they are a community that is spiritually vibrant, radically inclusive, and reflects a vision of the world which reflects justice, equity, and liberation. And then it says, be part of it. And our community, they go on to say, includes religious, secular, and atheist Jews, families and kids, partnered and single people, queer and trans people, disabled and chronically ill people, deaf and hard of hearing folks, interfaith families, Jews of color, white Jews, and anyone interested in experiencing Jewish life. So I guess here, just a little kind of caveat. I mean, obviously that's a fantastic, glorious kind of welcome for people, but just a little kind of interesting caveat here is that the term queer is used, and we've heard that term used a lot so far tonight. But you don't hear or see in this statement specifically lesbian and gay. And it feels like the lesbian and gay identity has somewhat been merged or possibly even kind of like erased slightly by putting it or lumping it into the term queer. And I think that this is problematic for some of the kind of thinking around radical inclusivity. Anyway, of course, whether or not organizations are actually radically inclusive or whether they're just extending the liberal reformist inclusivity agenda is a really interesting question. And certainly looking around today, the inclusivity mantra can be heard worryingly, I suppose, from within corporate offices, banks, businesses, to non-profit organizations, and absolutely everything in between. It is the zeitgeist. You know, every organization is describing itself as, if not radically inclusive, then certainly inclusive. And I think that there are some really serious questions that need to be asked about what is going on when quite conservative organizations decide that the adoption of radical inclusivity is going to be of some benefit to them. So I've cast a small amount of doubt here then on the requisitioning of radical credentials by not so radical groups. There's no denying, however, that change has been underway for some years now. And certainly within liberal Judaism, there are radical strands of thinking and action that reflect the broader changes happening within the worldview of progressive Judaism itself, which is seeing a movement from modern liberalism towards something more postmodern, post-liberal. And perhaps in tandem with this, the evolution of what is being described as post-Jewish Judaism. Unsurprisingly then, the theology, well, the theology that we don't really do, but our theology, is now more post-theistic, or certainly more post-monotheistic than it's ever been before. So I would recommend, if somebody wants to read a little bit more about this, Shalmar Gid's book that's got the title American Post-Judaism, which looks at these issues and the developing post-liberal opposition to modern liberal Jewish traditions, laws, status issues, and theologies. So in short, there seems to be a growing popularity for new forms of antinomianism, which means basically that there's a growing popularity for throwing out tradition and laws maybe that have been constructed around modern Judaism. Paradoxically, of course, this, I like this. I mean, this is part of my kind of like anxiety about radical inclusivity. So paradoxically, this rejection of tradition, modern traditions that have been created within movements like liberal Judaism, in a sense are becoming or have their own laws, which is interesting for all sorts of reasons, but crucially because it's ushering in a rearrangement and replacement of modern liberal Jewish theology and ethics with something else, a bit more fluid, a bit more non-binary, more immanent, embodied, and with an array of theologies that lean way more towards monist, cosmotheist, pantheist, all of which suggest to varying degrees that everything is inextricably intertwined and that the division and difference is fundamentally illusory. That the universe and everything in it is composed of one kind of stuff. Us, the cosmos, and God are all sort of the same thing. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to see how monism or oneism sits more comfortably with a non-binary, radically inclusive thinking and theologies. Maybe they're right. Maybe cosmotheism and monotheism, pantheism is the way to go. I don't claim to have any knowledge of such things. Although, and there's a caveat coming up here as well, I am wary of some monist metaphysical thinking and how this thinking has in the past been translated negatively into politics, with horrible consequences for the Jewish community and other minorities. Now, this is why this experience of trying to create a kind of oneism has been often critiqued within Judaism and certainly by modern Jewish thinkers. We have a long history of questioning one stuff, one people philosophies, and questioning and deconstructing the unconditional universal beliefs and statements, especially those that have utopic overtones that accompany them. Now, there's a really interesting book that I can again just recommend if you want to kind of have a look at how Jewish thinkers have dealt with utopic thought. I would suggest looking at Russell Jacoby's book called Picture Imperfect, Utopian Thought for an Anti-Utopian Age. It's really interesting. Now, this is where it really gets tricky for exponents of radical inclusivity. Within liberal Judaism, we're very happy to say that God is one and indivisible, but Judaism doesn't really do metaphysical oneness or unconditional, unbounded, universal theology, although liberal Judaism does sometimes come a little bit close to that. But what Judaism does do very, very well is the conditional and the particular, difference and boundaries. This is why we have so much commentary. This is why we ask so many questions. This is why we have interpretations and an altogether extraordinary and lively oral tradition. Absolute, unconditional statements, whether they're about God, law, morals, have in the past and continue today to be debated, questioned, and deconstructed. We only have to look at the amount of rabbinic commentary that surrounds the absolute and unconditional, and we might say at this point, radically inclusive command to love thy neighbor as thyself. We only have to look at this command to see how Jews have paused. We can see with Rabbi Hillel's commentary on this statement in Leviticus, to love thy neighbor, where Hillel does not choose to use the Torah's original phrase to explain the essence of Judaism. He does not say, love thy neighbor as thyself. Rather, he states, do not harm the neighbor. And this is because, possibly, maybe, perhaps, because Nachmanides suggested that loving your neighbor as yourself is an exaggerated expectation. It's not practical. So as a consequence, the absolute statement to love thy neighbor as thyself is modified within Judaism and made, I think, more doable by stating that not harming others is probably a little bit more realistic than trying to love them. We might ask then whether, on the same basis that the rabbis questioned the doability of the unconditional command to love thy neighbor, whether and to what extent the modern command for radical inclusivity is also an exaggerated expectation and therefore needs constant modification. Well, two modern, or really actually not modern, but they kind of cross the threshold of modern and postmodern Jewish thinkers who spent a lot of time discussing this were Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida. Both wrote extensively on how the stranger and also the neighbor should be treated and what sort of hospitality or inclusivity should be extended to them. Both of them began their approach to hospitality or inclusivity with a suggestion that true hospitality or inclusivity is an absolute. The basic idea being that true hospitality or inclusivity, to be hospitable, has to be unconditional. So, for example, if you really want to welcome the stranger, then don't ask them where they've come from or for what they, for what purpose they've arrived or for how long they're going to stay. True hospitality or inclusivity is not about contracts or exchanges then. It's about a radical exposure to the stranger. It's a welcome without a why. But it's also risky and not massively Jewish. Such hyperbolic politics or theology ask or demand from us a leap of faith in the stranger, who is an unknowable and unpredictable other. Levinas argued for something similar, saying that if hospitality or inclusivity is to be offered, then we're not to prejudge the guest, and that we shouldn't see other people through already preformed ideas. That's like ideas that have been shaped by society, ideologies, politics, theology, whatever, before we actually meet the individual. So crucially, what Levinas is saying is that the stranger or the guest is more than our idea of them. Now, clearly this seems right. But as we've seen with the latest news, but not actually new news, about the kind of endemic problem of male violence and police violence, for some communities, some vulnerable communities, sometimes it's safer to hold on to some of those assumptions, even though they may be preformed. And this is why many thinkers have observed that the stranger and indeed the neighbor are fundamentally and deeply paradoxical and problematic figures. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who a lot of people enjoy listening to, goes as far as to say and to question the very idea that we should be neighborly. It sounds kind of weird, but this is what he says. Or inclusive, because we can never know who the neighbor actually or really is. So for Žižek, the relationship with the neighbor signifies an uncanny and potentially violent encounter. Neighbors, as well as strangers, he observes, can be murderous. Now, this critique of hospitality is somewhat derived and supported by the psychoanalytic work of Sigmund Freud and later Jacques Lacan. Freud's concept of the Mensch, the neighbor, the fellow human being, is particularly intriguing because Freud describes how this figure, the Mensch, the neighbor, is positioned at the impossible intersection of family and society, or on the intersection of what is known, the family, and what is unknown, society. And what is intimate then, but also alien, unnerving and strange, and potentially dangerous. So Zizek turns Levinas's argument on its head. He sees in the neighbor or the stranger not someone who should command hospitality from us and that we should give without hesitation, but rather an unfathomable abyss of radical otherness. And it's this that makes the neighbor stranger such an impossible and unsettling figure. The neighbor stranger's presence poses the fundamental question of whether we can ever know another human being. The neighbor stranger is someone then who creates two opposed movements of feeling in us simultaneously. On the one hand, the neighbor's need constitutes an ethical demand from us to respond and to be hospitable, to include them. And on the other hand, the neighbor's otherness constitutes the realization that we cannot know or possibly even like or trust them enough to be hospitable towards them. The neighbor stranger who needs our hospitality then can be a problematic figure in the sense that they pose existential and ethical questions about the very possibility of human interconnection. Now, despite this hesitation or reservation of some sort about recognition and inclusion of others, I do think it's still beholden on us. It's still, in a sense, demanded from us that we act justly in the world. For liberal Jews, acting justly is a core teaching of which an ethics of hospitality or inclusivity plays a crucial part. But there could be an issue here, another issue, and it's about our changing context. The world has changed, and liberal Judaism now straddles two worldviews, one modern and the other postmodern, one liberal and the other post-liberal. And the consequences of this is that some strands within progressive Judaism are placing more and more emphasis on the post-liberal preoccupation with identity and recognition of difference, as opposed to, but not necessarily in opposition to, social justice policies and practices. So the next question then might be, to what extent does post-liberal Jewish inclusivity reflect liberal Jewish social justice policy and practice? So the first speaks primarily of the fundamental right to be recognized or seen or heard. And the second speaks more of upholding rights, equalities, and the redistribution of resources. This debate is usefully illustrated in a dialogue between two academics, Alex Honeth, who is big on recognition as social justice, and Nancy Fraser, who leans more towards redistribution as social justice. Now, according to Nancy Fraser, identity theorists have expanded our understanding of what justice entails, but they have done so at a price. The concern being that policies that are focused on recognition and difference are replacing social and economic issues. So in other words, questions of recognition are serving less to supplement and complicate and enrich redistributive struggles than to marginalize, eclipse, and displace them. Now, this is a really tricky issue for liberal Judaism. And I guess we need to work out whether we think radical inclusivity, with its post-liberal recognition politics and theologies, somehow negates or overshadows the prophetic redistributive politics and theology that LJ has historically pursued. By highlighting the potential problem that the popularity for recognition rights might have on the pursuit of social justice, it seems obvious to me that liberal Judaism, as a community that embraces inclusivity, should also be a community that thinks critically about recognition, difference, and inclusion, in order that we be coherently combined and these issues be combined with a political theology of redistributive social and economic justice. Our assumption should be that justice today requires both redistribution and recognition. And it seems entirely right that LJ articulates what that relationship between the two of them should be. Having said that, though, we can be sure that if we have that discussion, that we're not going to agree on all the issues. But that's okay. Disagreement is good, contrary to current opinion. And this brings me on to my next point, and closer to the conclusion. If liberal Judaism is a community that encourages inclusivity, then it should also embrace and make a virtue out of the dialogical. That is, one voice cannot be allowed to dominate liberal Judaism. We need two voices or more voices. And we also need what's being described as agonism. We need struggle. We need to really grapple with these issues because they are contentious. LJ needs to be the community that is unafraid to take on complex and controversial ideas, even if it finds itself in a state of intellectual and theological dissensus. So rather than aiming for the rather impossible utopic space of radical inclusivity, LJ might want to understand itself more in terms of being what Foucault described as a heterotopic space. A place, yes, that brings different people and ideas together, but which also accommodates unsettled and unresolved struggles for all the best reasons. Liberal Jewish communities then are not places of synthesis where minds meet in agreement, but communities of lively and free disputation, of lively and free argument. This is important, and I think it's really Jewish, because we've understood, in our literature at least, that not only is consensus unrealizable, but that the attempt to realize it has ended often in tyranny. So my concern then might be that radical and radically inclusive communities have a tendency to be inclusive of those who agree with their ethos and with the various progressive paradigms that they teach. And as a consequence, they have the potential to marginalize dissent and undermine the constitutive role of disagreement. So in addition to being dialogical and agonistic, Jewish communities also need to steer clear of what the philosopher Judith Rosen-Berry describes as, and I love this, degenerating into unimpeachable virtue. I think degenerating into unimpeachable virtue is a problem that liberal communities and progressive communities have. Because we then judge people on their failure to reach the vaulted heights of liberal conscience. Liberals, progressives, and radicals, Judith Rosen-Berry suggested, must, rather than intone ineffectual pieties, maintain a condition of earnest perplexity, of skepticism towards what appears virtuous, but can become oppressive. The work of liberal Judaism is then a kind of negative one as well as a positive one. The work of liberal Judaism, I believe, is to warn of the possible consequences of not holding our own progressive hegemony, of which radical inclusivity plays a part, to account. It cannot be given a free pass. So, in conclusion, I can't believe I've got here already. Have I been talking for really ages? But this is the conclusion. Liberal Judaism's version of radical inclusivity must not mistake itself for creating unity or for manufacturing homogeneity of opinion or of pressing people into an impossible ethics, no matter how progressive it sounds. Liberal Judaism, whilst retaining openness towards the many and the other, must also, and crucially, be skeptical of its own notions of progressive perfection. Is radical inclusivity liberal? I'm not sure. It's certainly an extension of liberal thought, but it also has the potential to become illiberal. Is radical inclusivity Jewish? Well, yes and no. It depends, as I've briefly and incompletely shown, on many, many different things. So, an inconclusive conclusion, but one that I hope invites more discussion and certainly more struggle with these issues, especially within the liberal Jewish community. Thank you all very much for listening to my talk. And I don't know what's happening now. I
mean, I could just spend the next hour asking you some questions because I have so many thoughts from that as per, and so many that spark off things that we've had conversations about. But I think we should at least give our audience, your audience, who have been in the room at this time of night and engaged, so I've been watching their faces so dynamically, a chance to ask you a few questions, if that's okay, and you have the koyach at this time of night to take a few.
I'll try.
Okay. So if there is anybody who would like to ask something, Ben, Coombe, I can see.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think the idea of kind of not building a community that just sort of agrees and reinforces its own ideas is like essential. But I guess my question is, how does that then become a community? Because I want to attend progressive services because that's the kind of people the kind of service I want to be in and the kind of community I want to be around. So like how does a community built on disagreement still have that same value, I guess?
Yeah, oh my gosh. It's the if I knew the answer to that, Ben, I actually, sorry, Ben, I need to see you. I'm talking into a blank space there. I suppose, I mean, look, we all join liberal communities because to some extent to some extent or another, we are liberals and we share a set of kind of progressive paradigms. I think that inclusive communities, in addition to kind of struggling with how can we kind of include people that are like us, we also struggle with the question of, well, who should we exclude? Which is an equally kind of like important question. And I really don't have the answer. I suppose I simply, I'm suggesting that we be cautious about arriving at a synthesis of what we think a progressive community is. And that I want to keep the question open. And disagreement is, I think at the moment in society, being somewhat quashed. And I would really like to see liberal Judaism being an organization that kind of counters that move.
Is that the ethic that binds us? The ability to be able to hold in that space the disagreement? Is that the community potentially?
I think it is. I mean, I think the Jewish community is perhaps unusual in its embracing of disagreement. I'm not sure that many other communities kind of think that that's necessarily a good way to build community, but somehow we've done it for 2,000, 3,000 years, and we're still here. So I guess it's it's a reasonably good track to follow. Whether it's a central plinth for liberal Judaism to build something on, I don't know. But I suppose I'm wary that disagreement is kind of being pushed to one side. And what we can do perhaps is show how disagreement can be done sympathetically, I mean, everybody's been talking
more than sympathetically, in compassionately.
And compassionately, yeah, maybe. Although there's some people that, I mean, I suppose I should say that as a rabbi. Being compassionate is kind of like essential. But you know what? There are some people who, I mean, this is the thing. When I was younger, I embraced kind of left-wing politics. Well, my family were left-wing and I embraced left-wing politics. And we kind of knew the people that we didn't like. And we weren't particularly compassionate towards them because they held a set of beliefs and thinking and did things that were dangerous. And so I'm not sure that I'd be compassionate towards everybody that wanted me to listen
those
to them.
that are within the community.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, we've got too many questions for me to dominate.
Oh, no.
I want to come to John. John's had his hand up for a while.
Who's John? Is that John?
Yes, John, who comes to every session that you are.
John, don't ask me anything too difficult. I've been drinking whiskey.
Okay.
I did warn them.
I'm sure this won't be too difficult for you, but thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I'm not quite clear on the difference, the distinction you're making between radical and liberal inclusivity. And if it is that the liberal inclusivity is a kind of graduated, we decide who we let in at the time of our choosing, and the radical one is where we are completely open to allowing people into this space of difference you're describing. So 2 points about that. One is, how do we deal with, how can we actually tolerate the intolerant when we bring people to our tent who are actually intolerant of people, whether inside or outside of the tent? How do we deal with that? And then the other thing is about actually finding a way to move forward in amongst that disagreement. I was thinking about this expression, the Talmud, of these and these are the words of the living God. And then I looked at it again and I remembered that afterwards it says, but the halakha is with Hillel. So at the end, you can have this disagreement, but you have to have some kind of decision procedure.
Right.
Not necessarily come from the heavenly voice as to how you move forward when you do have that disagreement.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, John. I don't know how you move forward. This reminds me of when I had to defend my PhD. Like, I kept being asked really, really long questions, and I couldn't remember what the question was at the beginning of it. But I think, yeah, I mean, for me, kind of like liberal inclusivity is something that, in a sense, like kind of naturally grows out of kind of Jewish hospitality. And we've extended, obviously, the kind of the meaning of that in our kind of current context. Radical inclusivity, as I said, I don't really know. It could be an extension, yet again, another step in the kind of Jewish inclusivity policies and practices. But my feeling is that there's also something that's coming from outside of the Jewish community into the Jewish community with concepts of radical inclusivity. And I mean, look, I've done absolutely zero research on this, but kind of like my guts kind of tell me something about that a lot of radical inclusivity and inclusivity thought has come from the church. And to me, in a way, Christian ethics, the Christian hospitality, is that sort of it's the extra step that I think Judaism goes, whoa, hang on a moment, that's actually not really very doable. And I think we're really good at not making too many unrealizable and kind of utopic statements about what we can actually do. And not harming people is actually, it's kind of like negative compared to loving people. But I actually think not harming people is, a good basis on which to start.
So we've got all of 7 minutes.
Oh no, Charlie, your voice just kind of keeps, I can't even see your voice.
And I'm kabooming I'm like your conscience.
No
so we've got 3 questions. We've got one from, they're going to have to be because we've got 7 minutes. So we've got one from Ross, one from Ruth and one from Renee. So perhaps all 3 of you will ask your questions and somehow Judith will try and attempt to answer the 3 of them and sum up all in 7 minutes, like the Wunderkind she is. So Ross.
Okay, I'll be quick. My brain's probably not quite working because it's quite late now. So you've got this liberal view and this post-liberal Jewish inclusivity. And I like to think I'm radical and inclusive. And if we say not harming others is a value, why do I kind of somehow feel a little bit worried about post-liberal Jewish thought? As to me, I feel like I might be excluded because I don't hold those same radical values. And I'm kind of in the middle.
Mm.
Hold it. Oh. Ruth? Ruth, are you there?
I am sort of in body at least.
I saw you pouring the coffee.
Yeah, well, yeah. I sort of almost understand, I think, possibly, maybe. This degenerating into unimpeachable virtuosity, I really like that expression. Because it's not, do you think it's, or maybe I'm making it doesn't seem very inclusive, because you do end up with a very hard line of some harsh judgments made, which you might not be right about. You might not have been right in what you thought of as which was the virtuosity,
right.
And then you exclude people who actually should be included, and then we've lost the radical inclusivity, have we?
Oh boy, that's brilliant. It's like a kind of, I really wish I hadn't given this talk now, because it's like a kind of Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. I can't actually remember, what I said 20 minutes ago, but Ruth, that was lovely.
Really good.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Renee.
No, Renee.
It's Renee.
Thank
Renee,
you.
we should give Renee
Hello,
the last
how are
word.
you?
Yeah. Ask me, Ruth.
I will make it very easy. It's just a quick question. You talked about liberal and post-liberal. You talked about these 2 directions that our movements are taking at the moment. And my question is, being progressive, there's a sense of being trapped in the sense that we want so much to be inclusive and to be consensual, that at some point we don't know how to deal with dissension. And the only way we manage to do it is just to walk out the room when we're not happy. So I think we need to bring back into our movement this capacity to say, you know what, and maybe even in a rude way, it doesn't matter. You know what, I don't like what you're saying. And in a way, we want so much to be, to include everybody in the tent, but we lost. I think it's a bit of a trap being progressive sometimes.
Look, guys, this talk is not going in the direction I was expecting. We're ending up with LJ is going to be like the community that you can just be rude to people, if you don't like them. And I suppose I was sort of suggesting that, but I hope there aren't too many people listening to this talk. Anyway, but Ross, Ruth, and Renee, I do not have a kind of coherent answer to any of your questions. They are a conundrum, and the whole point of me waffling on for 35 minutes was just to extend this conundrum of, what is inclusivity? But I'm hoping, as I said at the end of my talk, that we'll just be able to kind of carry on at some point. But I kind of like
I want to thank you, and I think that in so many ways, Rabbi Tikva has put in, inclusivity is about embracing difference and allowing for dissension and difference. And I think that's the conundrum that we're trying to play with, which is, how do we be inclusive while at the same time disagreeing with each other? How wide is our tent? Where are our boundaries and where aren't they? And I'm so thankful that you have given this part of the conference not only another area to wrestle with, but also stretched our brains and stretched our theology. And you have to come back now and talk to us about God and what do we do with our theology from this point?
I know. Look, I'm sorry, guys. I missed God out completely. I missed theology out of this talk.
That's why we have you here.
Oh, well, you always, I know you asked me to do theology, and I never do theology. I don't know if people are going to notice this at some point.
At some point, we're going to call you out, the great theologian, and never talks about God.
Yay!
Perhaps that's says something in and of itself. But Judith, it is always a pleasure, and I really want to thank you for being with us all the way from sunny Skye.
You guys, you're all really wonderful, and I will never disagree with any of you.
And John has called us all out for saying there was no theology. We know, John. It's only because it's Judith we can say that there wasn't. We know there was loads of theology. Otherwise, we would continue to be here in the room. Anyway, I want to invite back just to close up tonight and to close up the incredible program that has been. Rabbi Leah Jordan, tell us, please, what can we look forward to tomorrow?
Hi, everybody. Well, I'm Judith, I just wanted to thank you as well. My head is still spinning. I tried to write notes, and then all I ended up writing was very large paradigmatic concepts like totalitarianism, illiberalism, and an inconclusive conclusion, discussion, and struggle. So I thank you so much. The fact is that I think I know why you are in a red glow, and it's because you come in as sort of Gandalf from the Isle of Skye to drop some wisdom on us. So thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you. So tomorrow, I wanted to run through some of the highlights of the program. The first is, and maybe Rabbi Charlie, you can help me with this, is at 9 a.m. and it is an anti-racism workshop with Charlotte Fisher from Jewish Justice Center, a community organizer, and Shay Akiwowo, created together, the two of them, an anti-racism training specifically for Jewish communities, and they're piloting it, and their launch for us is the LJ launch of kind of looking at what they're doing. The important thing to emphasize about that is that you have to join this Zoom link, Charlie?
You need to register. So if you're watching us, the people in the room, it's fine. But anybody who's watching us, but anybody else, if you register, and that's not on StreamYard, that's on the website through the Google form.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And then there is Rabbi Tikva, who I think
who's in the room.
She's in this space.
Here. Absolutely. He's going to be on the floor. And as I mentioned today in my opening words, it's a really special day for or a very sad day, but a really special day for, there we go, we can see Ellie. I've just spotlighted Ellie, but it was Ellie's retirement day today, and so the fact that she's come back tomorrow to teach on Biennial, I hope is an indication that maybe retiring, but we will still be seeing you around a lot. Having your sleep first, but then but then around a lot. So Ellie will be with us tomorrow, so come and join Ellie.
That's going to be wonderful. And that's at 10 with Rabbi Ellie. And then 11 to right before 12:30 is Shabbat morning services, which is going to be, if you haven't been there yet, it's amazing.
It was incredible tonight.
Yeah, it was incredible at Friday evening, and it'll be as incredible or more tomorrow, because we'll also have Torah reading from different communities and a lot of amazing music. I'm
and
sure.
Ellie's back as well. Actually,
Yeah.
Rabbi Ellie Tikvaserah is back tomorrow, so twice. So really not a retirement, because Rabbi Ellie Tikvaserah and Rabbi Andrew Goldstein are going to be giving the sermon tomorrow.
Amazing. And I'm looking forward to all of that. And then there are lunch and learns at 12:30, so that people actually either can get some food, sit in a session, make sure you eat. And we've got Rabbi Renee, who's here, doing Judaism and Western esotericism, which is fascinating to me. And then Sarah Alston doing inclusion in the classroom. What is it and why is it so important? Which I think will be great.
I'm getting chased that actually we should let these good people go to bed.
Yeah, I agree.
So just remind them that most things are on StreamYard, so they are streamed. There are a few things in Zoom, including the lunch and learns, but particularly tomorrow night's programming, ELELS are running an incredible quiz, and you need to be in the room for that. You can't, it's not the same to be online, so register. And if you have enjoyed tonight, then please head over to our website before you go to bed. And remember that in order to continue delivering these programs for us, we need your donations. So join us tomorrow. And thank you so much for being with us. It has been, and for our speakers and participants, it really has been something very, very special. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and good night. See you.